those that I
This
love.
is discussion on possible action regarding temporary camping for profit on private property. The sponsors are Williams, McGordy, and Planning and Building Services. And I will give a brief introduction and then hand it over to Supervisor McGordy. Previously, the board had given direction to staff to bring private campsites into compliance. And I have some culpability. I think I had raised that, seeing the fire risk and sanitation problems at some sites on one of the vendors, HipCamp. And I don't think the board fully understood that many of these sites could not be brought into compliance because we do not have an ordinance for inland or coast that really accommodates this type of use. We have a process for full-on commercial campgrounds, but this item is really focused on the incidental camping use of a property. So maybe there's a primary residence or an agricultural opportunity and they want to add a couple campsites. And I don't think it was our intention to simply shut everybody down. The goal was to bring them into compliance. So we want to talk about a pathway towards compliance. And some of the concerns that we've identified, we met with Farm Bureau, we met with some of the stakeholders, Supervisor McGordy and Director Krog met with HipCamp. We want to make sure that whichever way we move forward, that it includes coastal. And we understand Coastal Commission may have their own thoughts on this, but we don't want to exclude the coast. We want a simple process. We don't want a major use permit that costs $6,000. We're looking for a permit that maybe costs a couple $100s, and I guess the question for planning and building will be, what can they do for a couple $100, rather than the other way around, where we start with a good idea and we find that it's quickly outside the reach of most of the potential participants. My concerns remain sanitation and fire. I would like the local fire agency to do an inspection, whether that's a one-time or annual. We need some thoughts from the board, and I would like there to be a sanitation plan. That could be a porta potty, but it's got to be, on a small parcel, and we need to think of the nuisance impact of just having a hole in the ground as the sanitation answer. And of course, we don't want to create a nuisance, but this is part of the sharing economy. It's about our rural residents having a diversified income stream. Most of them don't seem to be making a whole lot of money. I've heard between $3,000 and $8,000 a year, but it's supplemental. It helps their overall operation, and it brings more people to Mendocino County, and hopefully they spend money while they're here. Supervisor McGordy.
Thank you, Chair Williams. So I think you summed it up pretty good. I think the key issue here is that it's incidental to the operation as far as larger parcels are concerned, ag parcels. And there seems to be some issue about compatibility with Williamson Act, which we have to talk about. If that's not the case in other counties, because in San Luis Obispo County, where my family had property, we actually had a hunting club camp on our property, and it was fairly simple. The campers came in self-contained vehicles, and I think that's kind of the easiest level to manage, is where people just want to park an RV or a trailer on a place, and they're self-contained, so they really don't have to. The landowner is not providing much other than some level of safety and security for fire. And then it goes on up from there. So the more complex the camping arrangement that a person wants, the more complex, I guess, the permitting would be, because you have to provide some level of sanitation, as you said, probably a porta potty and wash water would be required, and that's fairly simple to set up. And in fact, you can rent that equipment from the porta potty businesses that are here in the county. And I agree with you, it's supplemental income that probably helps pay the taxes, but it also gives people potentially interesting camping experiences that you can't otherwise get. So, if someone's got a fairly large piece of property and they wanted to have up to 4 camping sites on it, that seems like that would be incidental, and yet it could still provide some money for people and help our economy. I think that correct me if I'm wrong on this, Supervisor Williams, but it seems like the HipCamp people said that Last year, we had 11,000 visitors in Mendocino County using HipCamp, and that they have a multiplier effect that I don't remember off that in terms of what it does for the economy, but it's something, and it would be a way for us to expand this suite of visitor experiences to enjoy the wilderness here in Mendocino County. So I'm supportive of it, but again, we can't do it at the expense of making the neighbors' living experience worse. So things like noise, light, fire, sanitation, those are all have to be taken into consideration for this to be a practical program.
Planning and building.
Thank you, Chair Williams. So I am grateful that both yourself and Supervisor McGordy are helping to co-sponsor this item. I would like to ask if the clerk could please bring in 2 representatives from the consulting group that we are working with on our zoning code update that relates to this item. That's Eric Norris and Liz Golden with Interwest Consulting. And so while they're being brought in, I'll just briefly summarize that right now, Planning and Building Services is undertaking a zoning code update to our inland zoning code, Division 1. And as part of that, we're looking into whether or not we include a potential allowance for temporary camping for profit on private property that is not considered the transient habitation campground use type, which is what requires the major use permit, the $6,000 to $8,000 application fee, and several months of processing. I want to note that we've provided with this item some information from HipCamp, and those are attached to this item. It includes, some of the data that's been collected from HipCamp about what kind of activity you're seeing within Mendocino County. And so with that, that's my brief introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Eric Norris, and we do have a small presentation to go through. So I will go ahead and share my screen and let Eric take it away. Thank you.
Eric, you're muted.
There we go. Start over again. Yeah, thank you, Julia. Again, I'm Eric Norris with Interwest. We have the pleasure of working with your staff on an update to the inland zoning code. We're not working on the coastal code yet. Well, actually, that's not part of our scope, but certainly everything we're talking about here could probably be translated in some way over to the coastal areas. Also on the call today, I think Julia mentioned, is Liz Golden with our staff, who's been tasked with looking into the whole hip camping issue in a little bit more depth. So we are here to talk briefly with the board today. We're looking really for your direction on some parameters around what you want to allow in terms of temporary camping, hip camping, whatever you want to call that. We'll write those regulations and they'll come back to you, but we're looking basically for your direction on sort of what the edges of this thing are. Next slide. So we're not talking about what you already have in the county in terms of allowed operations, private campsites. Now we've highlighted here an example that's in the coastal zone, but we think it's a pretty good example of sort of the larger type of commercial operations. This is the Casper Beach RV Park. They have tent camping, they have places for trailers, for RVs, and there's basically everything there. Showers, internet, toilets, the whole thing. We're not talking about that. Next slide. And we're not really talking about these other kinds of camping, the traditional campgrounds that I'm sure we're all familiar with, organized camps that may be put on by a church group or some other group. And we're not looking at RV campgrounds, which is kind of like the example at Casper that we just looked at. We're looking really at the sort of smaller scale. If you want to draw a comparison, it's more like sort of an Airbnb than a hotel in terms of sort of how it operates and the scale at which they operate. Next slide. So I'm going to talk just briefly about a few different aspects of this, and we'll conclude with kind of bringing this all together and then really looking for your direction, board members. So at one end of the spectrum, I think it was just mentioned, is the very minimal example of hip camping or just camping in general. we've kind of joked with staff about this is there's your site, here's a shovel, have fun type of approach. In both of these examples here, the folks who are doing this have arrived either on a bicycle or they've hiked in, they've pitched a tent, and as was mentioned, if you have to go in the middle of the night, you go off into the bushes and take care of whatever you're going to do that way. You would bring in your own water, your own food. There's no electricity. There's really nothing here except a place to pitch a tent. Next slide. Now from here we start going up into camping that has vehicles, and it could be a place to, instead of coming in by bike, you come in by car, you pitch your tent, and again there can be a whole range of other amenities that go with it, but we're now into an area where we're attracting folks who are coming here in a vehicle. Next slide. From there we start now going into, well, what else are we providing at the campground? Is it just a place to park a vehicle, pitch a tent, or are we starting to provide amenities? You can see examples here. Do you put a shade structure up? Do you have picnic tables? Do you have a semi-permanent kind of camping facility? The one on the right, I guess you would call kind of glamping. But this is still all within the range of what you could consider in the sort of incidental or temporary camping operation. It just, again, depends on where you want where you want the edges of that type of operation to be. Next slide. Now we're going beyond just having structures. We now have electricity, we have plumbing. So if you want to bring your satellite television or whatever, if you want to have running water for showers or for sanitation, we're now into, again, sort of up to another level in what you would consider temporary camping. Next slide. And then, again, I think was mentioned, one of the supervisors mentioned folks who would bring in their own self-contained vehicles, whether that's a trailer with, as you can see on the right-hand side here, that's going to carry its own water. You probably have a stove in there and so on. On the left-hand side, a very popular kind of camping vehicle that is more or less self-contained in terms of being able to sort of pull up to a spot and operate as a little mini campground. Next slide. And if we're into that question, if we're going to have self-contained vehicles, how large can they be? There's a whole range of different, motorhomes, trailers, etc. And it really has an impact on, what kind of people you're attracting and potentially what kind of impacts they're going to have on adjacent property owners. Next slide. So kind of summing all those up together, if we start off just with amenities, it's everything from the, here's a shovel, there's a spot for your tent kind of range, up to a more fully amenitized experience with electricity, toilets, etc. In terms of parking, we go everything from bicycles to personal vehicles up to potentially RVs of some size. Permanent structures, again, we go from basically nothing to simple things like picnic tables up to more or less permanent structures, as we're showing here on the right-hand side. Plumbing, electricity, everything from nothing over to fully plumbed. Now somewhere in the middle there would be, as was mentioned, things like porta potties. Those can come with their own little hand washing stations, but somewhere in that range is again, where do you want to hit? Self-contained vehicles, again, everything from a bicycle, which really is not a vehicle at all, up to just personal vehicles, and then getting into more and more self-contained and larger type of RV or camping vehicles. And then vehicle size, again, everything from a bicycle up to a full-sized motorhome. Next slide. So some things to consider. I think the two board members have already mentioned some of these. The number of campsites and the size of a parcel really gets to some of the issues that were mentioned about creating potential nuisances on adjacent properties and having them on a large enough property that whatever kind of noise or whatever is happening it has a chance to disperse before it hits the neighbors. Private and rural roads, the suitability of roads for whatever kind of camping that is. Obviously, if it's people walking in or taking personal vehicles, not as much of an issue. When you start getting into larger vehicles, it becomes more of a critical consideration. There are is the potential to increase traffic if we're now attracting people into rural areas that wouldn't normally go there. On private roads in particular, which there are a lot of in the county, there is the issue of shared maintenance and a lot of questions that come up about how that road was set up, what kind of easement is over it, what kind of access rights everybody has to it, and whether they can even have this kind of additional traffic coming onto their property. Some other questions: do we want to require hosts to live on site or nearby? That tends to provide better, an enhanced ability to make sure that things don't get out of hand if you're living there and hearing the noise that's coming versus someone just getting directions to a vacant site and being told where they can set their tent. Already mentioned RV and trailer size and length and sort of what the maximum size is that we want to allow. As has been mentioned, fire is certainly an issue, and when we have red flag restrictions in place, how does that affect the kinds of things that can happen on those campsites? But do you want to allow fires at all when those restrictions are not in effect? Certainly we don't want to allow them when they are in effect, but if they aren't, do you allow open fires? Do you require camp stoves, etc.? And kind of related to the parcel size and the number of sites is appropriate setbacks from neighboring properties or homes. Again, trying to make sure that if we're allowing this, we're not creating nuisances for the adjacent property owners. Next slide. And that's our presentation. So we can certainly come back to this if you'd like to go over anything in more detail. But we are just generally looking for your direction on sort of where in that spectrum you'd like to land. We'll take that direction, go back and write up the details, work with Julia and her staff, and eventually bring this back to the board. So with that, I'll end my presentation. Happy to answer any questions and assist in the discussion.
Supervisor Mulhern.
Thank you. I'm glad that this item's coming forward because I believe that this might be one of the only ways that some of our property owners in the North County in particular are able to retain their properties by offering hosting opportunities for beautiful areas like in Covelo and Spy Rock. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. One question that I had was regarding fire, and does that always mean an open campsite, or would that also mean, for instance, a small propane barbecue? Or what's the definition of fire?
Julia Krog, I can try my best to at least start off on that. I don't think we have really a definition of fire in our code in any capacity. I think what we were thinking about is sort of those open flames that you may see like in a fire pit and such. And I don't know if Eric has anything additional to add.
Well, if that's...
No.
Go ahead.
Liz, do you have any more information on that?
Open flame was the key indicator there. Open flames.
So that would include like a Coleman stove.
Right. I think an electric or something small would be fine, but.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm in support of having no open flames for these campsites. There are a lot of devices that offer technology to be able to cook food, and I know it's not quite as romantic to roast marshmallows not on an open flame. I just think, considering the county and the environment that we live in, I don't think it's safe. And regarding the pack out, I know that HipCamp's website does at some point say it's, okay to bury. I would prefer, if we're going to move down this path, that we have a fully pack out policy with our campsites. I mean, that obviously would not include porta potties or whatnot, but if we're going to head down the path of bicycling or hiking in, I think a fully pack out policy or ordinance or however it gets into the permitted system would be appropriate. And also, I really would like to keep the costs as low as possible because, like I said, I think this is going to be the only opportunity that some of our property owners in the North County have to be able to retain their properties.
I support you on the fire and the pack out. The last thing we want is a campsite to start a mega fire, and we definitely have that potential here. But for the cost, I threw out 200, maybe 250 for a permit. What do you think is reasonable? Let's start with the dollar amount, because what we don't want to do is make it so expensive that people operate outside of the legal system.
It is a business. So, I mean, there's other fees besides the permitting process. You'd have to have a business license and pay TOT tax. So there are multiple other revenue generating sources with a property like this. I am in favor of keeping it low. I can't imagine that $250 is going to be enough to cover staff time. I mean, I want to be very realistic about what we're charging, and I want to make sure that we're covering the costs of our team. And even, it may be a sliding scale or sort of a time and materials fee structure, where if you have a very simple plan and a very generic site, that may be less than somebody that has a much more complicated site on a private road, et cetera. So I think I'm in favor of looking at potentially a sliding scale fee structure that's going to cover our costs, but also not overburden the permittee.
Planning and building?
Yes, thank you, Julia Krog, Director. I will just comment that, any sort of business being operated would likely trigger the need for a business license. So we do have a fee already adopted for business licenses, and that does have a potential add-on fee where there may be like extraordinary, reasons why it takes above our typical standard processing time. So that's sort of that sliding scale approach. I think we are going to take the direction received from today and go back and sort of look at how we can best implement this with your direction that's received and see what type of permitting is appropriate, whether or not there's different tiers to that. And of course, this will come back in front of the board later this year, ideally. So.
Supervisor Jurdy.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation and for the outline. Currently, I'm looking at slide 11, and a couple of things that come to mind. So recently I was speaking with, actually yesterday, with someone who was complaining about the vacation rental next door. Now, this was on a 1 acre parcel, and I see the proposal here is sketching out 3 acres or more as the initial threshold, at least as a concept. But the problem that she was referencing was the house is listed for 10 people at a night, and very often it's absentee ownership. It's often more than 10 people that stay the night. They use lots of water. Everybody's on well water, and they're nervous as neighbors that their water is being depleted by the number of people at the vacation rental. I know this is HipCamp. This is not quite the same thing, but it has to do with the density of use and activity and oversight. So based on all that and everything else I've heard, I mean, another comment is that people are concerned that sometimes with a trailer, the person might put the trailer far from their house, but next to their neighbor's house. So I think not only do I think that the on-site presence is really important. I'd like to see that the on-site host has to be on-site, live on-site. And whether it's the owner or a renter, but somebody is the on-site responsible party, and that the campsites must be closer to the host house than it is to the neighbor's house. I think that will help control noise because if they're going to get out of hand, the people living there who are collecting the rent are going to hear it at least as badly as the neighbors. And then finally, on the idea of the sliding scale, one concept would be, I mean, these look like they're possibly manageable at 3 acres, two sites, camping sites, but not every case is that going to work out. So what I would say is, on your concept is 3 to 5 acres. Maybe it's one campsite is the cheaper fee, but if you want to go for 2 campsites on 3 acres to 5 acres, you pay for a more robust review. Same thing, and it's conceivable that 5 sites in in 5 to 10 acres works out. But I think if you want, say, more than 2 campsites on 5 to 10 acres, you get the more robust review. And that would be a way of having a more substantial review for neighbor impacts, septic, porta potty issues, all that stuff if you're scaling up.
Supervisor McGordy.
So a question for Planning Building Services. What is the fee for a vacation rental if someone wants to establish a vacation rental where it's still permitted?
It depends on if you have frontage on a publicly maintained road or not at this time. So if you do not have frontage on a publicly maintained road, you're obtaining a minor use permit. And Adrian, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's around like $3,000 for that application fee. And then for a business license, the board did approve a fee increase for our business license reviews. And do you remember that right off the top?
I believe it's $449.
$449 is the current cost to obtain for the business license portion. But as Supervisor Mulheron said, there is also add-on fees such as paying TOT, things such as that.
Mm-hmm. And if the vacation rental was on a public right-of-way?
Oh, that's just the business license fee. That's the $440.
I got it. Okay. And as far as the on-site owner, I think that's an excellent idea. That, again, remember, this is supposed to be not necessarily a business. It's supposed to be incidental to what your property is used for. And what we don't want is people buying rural properties and setting up HipCamps and then just letting whatever go on. So I also like the idea of some restrictions on light and noise if it's under a 10-acre parcel or whatever. So really, I think light and noise pollution is an issue in rural areas, and what we don't want is people that want to come up and have a loud rave until 2 a.m. I feel strongly about that. Living in a rural area, I don't really like light pollution and noise.
So I'm going to join you. There's 3. There's a majority for somebody has to be managing on site. That said, I think we should allow use permits where that may not be the case with some discretion. As we reviewed, so this is already happening in our county. We're talking about it like it's a new idea. And in fact, this has been going on for some time, and it's all out of compliance. We don't see a lot of nuisance problems created to date. And when we met with Farm Bureau, one of the members pointed at, I think it was a 1-acre site, and reading the reviews and saying, well, nobody's complaining about it. It's been in existence for quite some time. Made me realize, well, maybe 3 acres, the 3-acre threshold isn't necessary. But I think we should make it easy to revoke these permits. If the sheriff gets called out for any reason, noise, anything substantiated, I think that's a reason to revoke it. There has to be a burden on the operator. Don't create a nuisance for your neighbors. If you do, you're going to lose the right to operate the campsite. Supervisor Mulhern. Haschek.
Thank you. I agree with most of what's been said so far. Certainly, this is an opportunity to expand some of the economic benefits of the beauty of our county. One question would be, what kind of notification would be given to neighbors, in this process if we go for a minor use? Or, it seems like the neighbors should have some kind of input. If it's a 3-acre parcel, these people are going to be nearby. And also, I was just thinking about what happens if a person says, okay, you can bring your RV and we'll say it's HipCamp or whatever, but then you can end up staying there for forever. And you create these little RV camps out in the woods. So what kind of protection would we have from that kind of situation?
Supervisor McGordy.
No, you bring up a really interesting point, because I know that there, again, like our hunting camp in Paso Robles, the people would bring their trailers in at the beginning of summer and leave them there till fall. So there are people that like to do that. I don't think that's what this is, though. I think that this is more of a limited transient stay. And I think it would be smarter to take that approach so that we don't have, if nothing else, things getting abandoned out there that, someone forgets to come pick up their trailer and suddenly we're starting to create rural blight. So I think it's probably advisable for us to have some sort of a limit. Much like a lot of campgrounds, 2 weeks, that's as long as you can stay.
I would support that as well. Looks like there's a majority. Supervisor Mulhern?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to offer the oppositional view to living on site. So again, I'm talking about on Spy Rock Road or way out in Covelo. There may be properties that those property owners need this income to pay to retain their property. And it may not be the best use of the space that's available for them to stay on site while there is somebody visiting the property in a HipCamp type capacity. So I understand that if you are in a more residentially dense area, that having on-site property owners is important. But again, Mendocino County is not a one-size-fits-all property community, and so I think there needs to be some level of options for people that live more remotely to not have to remain on site.
Would a compromise be a documented address within a certain drive time or road mileage? I think and this is why I brought up there's edge cases where we look at what's already happening, and there are sites where people don't live on site. They live on a different parcel, maybe not even adjoining, but nearby. I'm comfortable with that. What I'm concerned about is opening the floodgate to people out of area who don't live in our county, buying rural land to create campsites. That strikes me as a risk to public safety.
Yeah, I understand that, and if there's an opportunity for whatever that drive distance looks like, I think for our employees, it's 45 minutes, or interim CEO Antle, do you know off the top of your head what our drive time is for employees to be near their work site? Is it 45 minutes?
Darcy Antle, interim CEO. I believe as disaster service workers, it's roughly an hour and 15 minutes. I think it's 75 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with that. And I also think, the registration sites, I don't think what we're talking about here is creating our own type of registration site. It would be through whatever web portal already exists. And those portals already have built-in features for not only rating the facility that you camp at, but also for rating the campers. And so there are ways in which people that don't follow the rules at whether that's an Airbnb or whether that's a HipCamp, are no longer allowed to rent through those websites. So there are some protections in place.
Supervisor McGordy.
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about safety issues too, because again, you got to be streetwise, just like us going to San Francisco and urban people coming into a rural area. That's why I kind of like having somebody on site to sort of keep them out of trouble. And there's all sorts of ways that people could get hurt or lost or whatever. And I'm a little concerned about having unattended people staying in our rural areas. I get Supervisor Mulheron's issue about trying to generate some income for people who otherwise might lose their property or not be able to pay taxes or whatever. There's some self-interest for us here too. So, but there has to be some sort of buddy system so that when someone's occupying the property, we know about it and we can check up on them if need be.
Supervisor Haschek.
Yeah, I agree with Supervisor McGordy on that, is that I would like to have the owners be there, because you don't know if these people coming from the city are going to bring guns and, shoot off all night long or whatever. That kind of stuff happens. And so I think if you have owner, resident, it takes care of a lot of those kind of issues.
Supervisor Jurdy.
This again about the on-site responder to the facility, and the vast majority of people are not going to do this. we could talk about it as a way of income for some people, and it will be some subset of the population. Most people, the vast majority of their personal wealth is invested in the house where they live. And so they are very protective of their house and their quality of life, especially during COVID, where they've been sheltering in place. So I think it's really important for us to caution ourselves to go slow on this and to not open up the floodgates and then hear complaints after the fact. It'd be better for us to move, cautiously, like I was saying. Maybe if you go with a smaller number of sites, you get a smaller reduced review. You ask for more sites, the maximum allowed more than the minimum in your zoning district. You're going to get more intensive scrutiny because we are going to get complaints, and there's going to be bad actors in this, and so we need to be mindful of the vast majority of the people in this county who are not going to rent out and are going to be unhappy with their neighbor who may be an absentee landlord.
So I agree with just about everything said, but I do want to recognize that this has been going on for years, and we're not sitting on those complaints. And the cases that we're considering to exclude are already happening. And what I learned I don't want this to look like the cannabis ordinance in any way. I would say that may be the worst ordinance of local government anywhere ever. And when you see the fallout with it, there's maybe 400 that'll get approved in the end, maybe, and there's about an estimated 2,400 that are operating illegally. And so if we need to create a framework where we can bring people into compliance. If we make it so restrictive that most can't qualify, they're going to continue operating outside of the system, which means we have no oversight at all. They don't get a fire check. We don't get the 10% of revenue as our TOT tax. We get nothing out of it. So I'm with my colleagues on everything said to date, but I would like staff, when they look at the existing campsites, if they find that most will be out of compliance and can't come into compliance, bring it back to the board so we can reevaluate. The goal is to have a legal market. Planning and building.
Thank you. So on that point, I just want to make sure that, one thing we're going to have to make sure is really clear in this ordinance is what is sort of the evidence that is showing that somebody is operating a HipCamp facility. That's really going to allow us to conduct enforcement on sites that may not still come into the permitted arena. That's going to be, we already have standards about what it shows as being an occupied travel trailer in terms of evidence that may support that we can utilize. That's going to be something we're going to need in order to be able to handle enforcement as well. I think there's been a real great discussion here today on some direction points to us. And what I'm hearing is that there's a desire to see some level of flexibility and really look at what we have in different zoning areas, in different sort of environmental settings in terms of residential character versus in more rural, unpopulated sort of areas. But one thing that I do really encourage the board is to make sure that any site that has a HipCamp or a private camping facility, that this is not the primary use of that site. If it were the primary use, it should really be treated as the transient habitation campground facility. This truly should be something that is accessory to or incidental to your primary use, your residential use, agricultural use, something along those lines, not so that you see properties that solely have these campground facilities. Otherwise, those should really be coming in underneath the commercial use type when it is the main use of the property. Thank you.
There's the issue of the Williamson Act, which I think presently doesn't allow this. Is that what we discovered in our discussion with Farm Bureau?
Not necessarily, but what came up in that discussion is that the county is behind in a Williamson Act audit, and maybe that would be the starting point.
Okay.
If I may, there is actually a section within the policies and procedures that were adopted by the board for Williamson Act contracted lands. And there is a section, it's 9.6D, that does list temporary camping as an incompatible use. So if the board did desire to see camping to be allowed on those sites, we would need to think about addressing that provision within the policies and procedures for Williamson Act contracted lands.
Okay, I think we're going to have to do that. And then the other issue is that I see this in my own neighborhood where there's people who will have an event basically, and and suddenly, 5 to 10 travel trailers are there, and it's obvious they're having a lot of fun. I don't want to break it up because it usually involves horseback riding and things like that. And also the gun club, I know, has events where they bring in a lot of campers, and I don't think they have any real permit. And I just wonder is that something else, in all fairness, that we should consider, a 1-day permit, or how would we handle that to make this equitable?
Director Krog.
Thank you. So what I can say is that, when you're holding events, if it's over 100 people, you do require an administrative permit through our office. We don't typically see that. There could be discussion too, and we can talk about that, Eric, Liz, and myself about that too, about if we just have a strict prohibition on if you're doing camping underneath sort of this private, temporary camping on private property, that you're not allowed to have events necessarily associated with that, if that's the desire of the board, without obtaining maybe additional permitting related to it. So.
Supervisor Dirty.
I'd like to get some feedback from the consultants on these maximum numbers that are shown on slide 11. On the coast, there's an agriculturally zoned parcel. Therefore, it is more than 40 acres in size. And it is a farm. It is not under the Williamson Act because it's too small to be under the Williamson Act, at least in Mendocino County. Although I've read in Napa County, they allow people to be in the Williamson Act down to as little as 5 acres. So I don't know why ours doesn't give them the same tax write-off as the Napa County does. But anyway, I believe they have 5 campsites on 40 acres because they really are using it as a farm, and it's a supplemental income to the farm. And so when I see 10 to 20 acres, a maximum of 10, I'm just trying to grasp how is that really going to be incidental to the activity or other use of the property. Not every property is going to be an active farm, but these numbers look really large to me on these per parcel. If it's just an incidental use, if the property was basically a campsite, 10 sites on up to 10 to 20 acres, sure, you could get 10 to 20 campsites on 20 acres, and if that's all that the property is used for. But we're not talking about a commercially zoned, campsite.
Julia, would like me to answer that?
Yes.
Well, just a thought. Well, first of all, the numbers here are just a starting point, and definitely, appreciate the discussion. I mean, you could do a couple of things here, just kind of right off the bat. You could limit it up to just a maximum of no more than a certain number. I'm not sure what that number is. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's something less than 10. You could do that by itself, or you could also combine it with something that says that they have to be, if you have more than one on a site, on a parcel, that it has to be a certain distance from the other one. Now, I guess we're trying to keep them all relatively close to whatever the home is here. But if the idea for this, whatever we call it, hip camping, is that you come to Mendocino County to have a rural experience, if you want to stay in the campground and be around a lot of other people camping, you've got campgrounds to go to. But if you're looking for more of a sort of individual quiet experience, does it make sense then to have these individual hip camp locations on that parcel far enough from each other that they're not disturbing the other campers?
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm just concerned about disturbing the adjoining neighbors who are not participating in this part of the economy. Yes. And are concerned about their quality of life being impeded upon by somebody else. I mean, as the saying goes, my right to extend my arm ends where your nose begins.
Exactly.
And so we need to be aware of the rights of the neighbors.
Yeah, I like the suggestion or the idea that these should be closer to the home than they are to the adjacent property owners. And that's something, again, as you get maybe more campsites, the idea of a sliding scale or a sliding approval process based on what you're doing. But those issues of site-specific considerations about exactly where on the parcel are they proposing to have these things, and where is that in relation to the property line, to the adjacent residences, that's all stuff that needs to get looked at. Because we do want to make sure that we're not destroying the neighbor's experience as we're doing this on these parcels.
Supervisor McGordy.
Yeah, I think that that's very important for any campsites on smaller parcels. Someone who has a larger property, being close to home probably isn't so desirable. I'm thinking of, a neighbor who has 1,800 acres. I don't see any reason why they'd have to have a campsite next to their house. I mean, there we'd have some flexibility. So we're probably creating some sort of a crazy matrix here that we have to follow. But the point is that there should be some flexibility. There could also, the key thing is always incidental, and I don't, that could be done with an income test in some cases, or activities, or I don't know what. Although Dan made a good point about how the house being a kind of a major investment for the owner, and that is the main purpose of the property as a residence, and then this would be incidental to that, kind of an accessory income and dwelling. So I'm just kind of putting all this out on the table to make everyone understand that there's going to be a lot of different permutations on how people use this, ranging, and again, some of it's going to be fairly simple. Having places where people can pull their individual RV going to be relatively isolated from others, and self-contained is going to be different than if we're going to have tent camping and you bike in. So these are, and I agree with what Supervisor Williams said, that the last thing we want to do is create something analogous to our cannabis ordinance. So we want to keep it fairly easy and straightforward. And then it could be revisited if we start having problems. We will revisit the ordinance and adjust it accordingly. So that the goal of this is that, yes, we would like opportunities for landowners to have extra income and visitors to have unique experiences, but at the same time, not at the expense of the neighbors.
If it's all right with the board, I'd like to put up a couple slides. These are from HipCamp, and it was from their study on the impact in San Luis Obispo County. The reason I pulled these out of the stack is I think the activity that's documented there is representational of what we already have happening in Mendocino County. And these were submitted to the clerk, so they will be on record. So they had 73 HipCamp hosts. These are the private property sites, bring in 16,700 guests, which generated 29,250 nights outside, which represented $3.2 million per year in their county. And I thought it was interesting that was split between retail, groceries, restaurants, recreation, and transportation. And as I started from a perspective of we need to restrict this, it's a nuisance, to we need to find a way to make it compatible, because the direction we're going in Mendocino County is to be so restrictive that we create outlaws and we limit outside revenue. The one thing that we should be fighting, our top priority, is poverty. And one of the ways we address that is we bring more dollars from out of county into county, where they can get recycled in our local economy. This looks like a compatible way to do it. It doesn't involve extracting resources that we don't have. Looks like it's possible to do without a nuisance. This was the second slide that I pulled out. They estimated $274 million of annual value to their county financial ecosystem on goods and services as a result of those HipCamp stays. I would like to see $274 million injected into Mendocino County's local economy. Supervisor Haschek.
Well, we have that question about the Williamson Act. So have we clarified that at all? Or how do we deal with that? And what does the board need to decide?
Julia, can you remind us of 9.6D?
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the unmute button there. So Julia Krog, Planning and Building Director. 9.6D is the incompatible uses with Williamson Act contracted lands, and specifically calls out tents and tent camping and basically any any type of camping facilities. So what would need to happen is essentially direction to prepare an amendment to address that provision if it were to be that the board wanted to allow this on Williamson Act contracted lands, which is what I am hearing is at least the desire I've heard mentioned by a couple board members here.
I think we have a majority for that amendment proposal.
Yes.
I would request that if we're looking at the Williamson Act, that we look at the minimum acreage requirement. Again, I recently read that in Napa County, they have a process where they can allow people to have as little as 5 acres, I believe, in the in active agricultural activity to be in the Williamson Act. And I believe our county has a much higher threshold. And it excludes a lot of people who sell their produce at the farmer's market from participating and getting the tax benefit of the Williamson Act. But that provision sounds like it's not a state problem, it's a county problem.
Supervisor Jordy, I'll support you on that and see if we have a majority, but I do want to ask County Council when he gets back whether we can give that direction now. It's really outside of the scope of the agenda item. But I do support you on that, and I hope we can piggyback on that, asking staff to perform a Williamson Act audit. It's well overdue.
If I may, through the chair.
Yep.
So I just want to add that going through the Williamson Act policies and procedures, I mean, of course, if there's support and if we get that direction today, we'll have to do some review and research. I'm unclear on where the incompatible determination came from for the temporary camping. So there's going to be some research required on our end just to make sure there's not an issue through state law or anything like that with removing that. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to the board. The direction today does not mean that we're going to come back and say, yes, we can easily do this. We just need to be able to do that research and review.
McGordy.
I thought years ago when talking one time with Dave Bankston that he said, if you're in an area that's Williamson Act and you have a non-conforming parcel as a adjacent owner who is willing to join in, you could do it. And I don't know if that provision's gone. So, for instance, I'm surrounded by, I think it's a minimum 40 acres. And theoretically, my 36-acre parcel could be put in the Williamson Act in the olden days. Maybe things have changed and that's not the case. But it makes sense when you have an agricultural area to properties that are contiguous with it. If they're committed to farming and they're smaller, they should be allowed.
County Council is back. County Council, we have a couple ideas for modifying the Williamson Act related to allowing HipCamps, but also allowing smaller parcels. Supervisor Jordy pointed out Napa may have a 5-acre minimum. Is that within the scope of this item for today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would recommend bringing that back as a separate future item, really identifying specifically changes to Williamson Act.
So I think maybe the direction could be to direct staff to bring that item back for discussion. And likewise, we're overdue on a Williamson Act audit. Does that need to come back?
Yes, I think you could bring both of those back.
CEO Antle, can you capture those?
Yes, thank you.
Let's go to public comment. Starting in room.
Hi, Carrie Shattuck. I had no idea that these HIP camps were available. I, myself, a camper, love to be out in bigger areas than confined in a little tiny campground next to a bunch of people. I think it's a great idea. The site, like Jordy, I agree with most of what all of you have said about it, but I think that there's too many sites in such a small area. I definitely think that needs to be addressed. I think like the 3 to 5 acres, it should only have like one site, because then I've always lived on rural and mountain properties, and between the traffic and whatnot, you're gonna have issues with people. I think the permit should be based on your size of property and how many sites you have as well, because people aren't going to want to spend as much for a permit if you have less sites. I definitely think that there shouldn't be plumbing or electrical at these, because we know how hoopty people can be with running electrical somewhere, the fire hazard. I totally agree, no fires, barbecues or whatnot. And the other thing is like the hosts required, because people wander, people come from the city, they have no idea where property boundaries are. They're wandering onto other people's land, especially with like cannabis cultivation. That's definitely an issue. And myself, having lived on, mountain properties, people have no idea where property lines are. So if you have a host, they can show where those are, as well as like search and rescue. People are out getting lost. You send them to a place out in Covelo. They might not even be on the right property. They may be trespassing onto someone else's. Also, the maximum of like 2 weeks, and the complaints. If people are having complaints, then their permit gets withdrawn, because no one wants to live out in the country and have campers disrupting them. So, thank you.
For those online, you can press *9 to raise your hand or click the raise hand.
Good morning. My name is Tyler Nelson. Thank you for considering an amendment or creating an ordinance for dispersed camping. My family farm is between Hopland and the timer hasn't started yet, is between Hopland and Ukiah, where we grow grapes and pears. We have a winery and a tasting room. We host concerts and weddings and other events for the community, and we have a campground as well. We started the campground at the beginning of COVID in order to help sustain our tasting room. We used a program called Harvest Host. We don't charge. The campers stay a night for free, and they're all self-contained, which means they bring their own toilet and their own water. It's been an incredible success. I don't know how to quantify what it has brought to our farm. It's generated traffic for the tasting room. It's given me an opportunity to talk to people about what a family farm is about, which is always great when we have votes coming up about different things, because we want family farms to be supported. During COVID, it allowed me to maintain my employees in the tasting room because we had customers coming in. The success of the Harvest Host program, which is free camping, has inspired us to investigate using a program like HipCamp, where we have a paid model. We're considering charging so everything is self-contained. It's RVs, you have to have your own toilet and water. We're considering using the same model for HipCamp, which works. It's easy. I have yet to pick up trash from any of the many customers that we've had come through. And I just lost my train of thought. Anyways, it's been fantastic. Currently, we're using about 14% of our property where we have economic income coming in. The rest of it is just beautiful hills and river access that is not generating any income. Having a program like Harvest Host or perhaps HipCamp would give us the opportunity to bring in significant income. We're talking about a lower side of a lower price point, but some of the examples that we saw in the presentation are really interesting, where it's more the glamping model. So instead of $45 a night, it's $200 a night, and they do it in Hillsburg, and it's something that we're considering. So as you're thinking about how to go through this process, keep kind of a broad vision, please. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Supervisor Mulhern.
Thank you for coming today, Mr. Nelson. Do you live on site at the winery, or would that conversation be a barrier for you to run a business?
I do live on site. It's really interesting. The model that we're using, listening to your discussion, has kind of opened up my perspective on what the different problems might be. Our property is approximately 1,800 acres. The campers that we currently have are maybe a mile away from me. This future camping area that we're working on is a mile and a half away from me. And so the concept of having my home close to the campsites is a deal breaker because, I mean, it's 1,800 acres of property. And I can envision, so we lease the property out, the rangeland out for cattle. We earn about $1,000 a year, which is not a whole lot of income. The camping potential has been really, really interesting. But when you're talking about 1,800 acres and having dispersed camping where somebody has a unique experience and they're from San Francisco or LA, living next to that campsite is, it's kind of a deal breaker for the concept that we have. So the county we live in is extraordinary. The compliments that we get just flow in every day. It's been really, really interesting inviting people from outside into our community. It's generated a ton of income, but I think it's also generated a ton of goodwill for our community in the sense that people go, oh, so this is what nature looks like. I can see the stars.
And a question from Supervisor McGordy.
Well, just a comment. So Mr. Nelson's my neighbor, and I can see where some of his guests stay, and they're pretty low impact on the neighborhood. They're far enough away from me, first of all, that it's quiet. I don't think they're particularly noisy people anyway. And I compliment Mr. Nelson on trying to figure out how do you keep multi-generation families on the farm, and watching the Nelson family go from just sort of being commodity sales to where they're doing value added and agritourism is inspirational, and I think it's a good model for what Mendocino needs to do. To refer back to Supervisor Williams' comments about how do we bring money into our community without creating a horrible impact or the need to expend more resources. So this seems to be, what the Nelsons are doing is really good.
Question from Supervisor Jurdy.
Yeah, so Mr. Nelson, at 1,800 acres, your parcel is a little bit bigger than the average in Mendocino County. So I think most of these permits would be for properties much smaller than yours, and that's certainly what I had in mind when I was talking about the camping sites being closer to the on-site host as the neighbors. But what's the closest you would envision any of your campsites or future campsites being from its nearest neighbor?
So our current campsite is, and again, this was a COVID shift, but it's the parking lot of our event area. And it's beautiful, but it is a parking lot. And it's about, probably at the closest, 100 yards away from our neighbor. We have yet to receive a complaint. Again, it's just been, and again, I've been in camp, I grew up camping. I've been in the situations where there's loud, rowdy, people are drunk and causing havoc. This experience that we have had has just been extraordinary. I was not looking forward to it. Our farm is private, but since we've started to open it up and really diversify, this experience has been just really stellar. I understand the problems that we need to avoid for our community. My experience has just been outstanding.
So just a concept to toss out, because again, you're dealing with a much bigger parcel than I think most people are working with. But if a concept was, closer to the site manager owner than to the neighbors, maybe a qualifier could be, but in any case, no closer than 300 feet from the adjoining neighbor. 300 feet does sound a little bit close. I guess it depends, on the site. Is there terrain? Is there trees? What's separating the campsite from the adjoining house?
Yeah, the one thought that I have about somebody mentioned that if you have a complaint, the sheriff is called, you have the option to lose your permit. And I think that is pretty good motivator for the owner-operator to make sure that he or she is doing a good job. It also gives the opportunity for a rotten neighbor to be rotten. But it's that concept made sense to me.
How many campers have you had since you started?
You know, I forgot to bring that type of information. We, because we don't want to, you know, part of our concept is it's beautiful. We want people to come and have a unique experience. The area that they're parking in is probably about 2 acres. When it's busy, we'll have up to 10 campers, which is rather unusual. And it starts to feel a little bit crowded, so we've developed some other areas.
And has the sheriff been called out?
Again, this has been an extraordinary experience. The people, it's a different customer than we've had before. It's a different type of customer than our typical wine tasting customer. People walk to the tasting room. It's just been extraordinary. We haven't had a single call, and I'm guessing, in the last 2 years, 400 guests. It's a wild guess, but it's just been absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions I see.
All right, thank you. I'm going to leave just some notes that I didn't stumble through, so thank you.
Thank you. Next commenter is Devin from Farm Bureau.
Good morning. So I appreciate the conversation, and I did appreciate the opportunity to meet with Supervisors Williams and McGordy with our Land Use Committee last week. Most of the considerations that the consultant brought forward regarding concerns were echoed by our members. I guess I wanted to bring up a couple points specific to Williamson Act. One, to Supervisor Jurdy's question, back in 2015 or so, when our policies were amended, we actually reduced our contract size. So currently, if you've got prime agricultural property, which usually means it's irrigated, actively farmed, it's only a 10-acre requirement. For non-prime properties, mostly considered rangeland, it's 40. So that was a significant reduction that's already in place. There is a requirement to have an established agricultural preserve of 100 acres, of which those contracts are part of, but there are exceptions to that the board can make. My main concern is where the board might be going and looking at 9.6D, considering what is compatible versus not. And I just want to remind the board in terms of Williamson Act that qualifying has to be agricultural income. And those compliance forms are supposed to be sent out at least every 4 years. So in 2010, when our previous Ag Commissioner, Tony Liniger, sent those out, it had been a significant amount of time, and 50,000 acres were found to be in non-compliance and were non-renewed. In 2020, our assessor sent out revised compliance forms. To my knowledge, that process is still moving forward for determining what is and what isn't compliant based on that last response. So the concern is that, if there is an opening up of the Williamson Act, there needs to be a sustained process in place for looking at what is considered compatible. Structures are a question for some of those glamping types of setups that were presented. So this could be a pro in Mr. Nelson's situation. He maintains the property. He's well-versed. He's close to town. He takes a management responsibility. But there's going to need to be some sort of oversight. And one question I had in terms of the county's permitting authority and how that really interacts with the responsibilities of these registration sites, whether it's HipCamp or the one that Mr. Nelson uses or others that are out there. It seems that some of these individual registration companies need to take some responsibility. And I've talked with HipCamp, and it seems like they're willing to do so. But that is something that needs to be considered in terms of how this process moves forward. And we look forward to participating when a draft is presented. Thank you.
Ron?
Yes, this is really nice to hear the concern of the supervisors for these small, particularly in the northern area of the county, parcels to have some form of income. The 3-acre parcel, I think, is reasonable. That seems to be quite a large size. The concern about neighbors, traffic, those all seem to be addressed. And this, unlike the vacation rental issue, is not taking up housing from locals. And I think the caveat should probably be a good contract with these campers, as some might find that you might have a camper that comes and decides, they want to stay for 14 days. And in California, after 14 days, they can be stuck there for quite a while. Now, the other side of this is hearing, the comparison with the cannabis ordinance, which does not work in all cases. And I hope going forward, I heard at least 3 supervisors today bring up the cannabis issue, that you would have the similar concern with cannabis. And, if someone were able to cultivate their own cannabis, that could save them between $1,600 to $2,500 a year from the cost of a dispensary. And right now, listening to this at 3 acres, yet with cannabis, we're looking at 10 acres. And, a cannabis plant doesn't wander. A cannabis plant doesn't start fires. A cannabis plant doesn't cause noise. So I hope that I would like to, hope that 2 supervisors would bring back the issue of the minimum acre of 10 acres for cannabis and, be parity across the county. If we feel that 3 acres is good enough for camping, I hope that we can bring that 6 plant, 100 square feet outdoor down to access those people who would have 3 acres. Thank you.
Next, we have a number ending in 6554. Please state your name for the record.
Yes. Lee Howard.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, I have great concerns with what you're looking at. One, I hope somebody starts addressing the ingress and egress issue, where you have a easement that feeds a back piece of property, and it's for residential only. And all of a sudden you start running a HipCamp to it. This weekend I had 20 vehicles that came through to the HipCamp. The HipCamp in this particular case has an outhouse recently built, and everybody uses it. You look at the pictures that I have of the camping, and you find that they're set up tents out in high grass, no clearances, no nothing, and you can't find who is even responsible. So as you move ahead with this, I hope that you take the time to look at the areas around that are being affected. This particular HipCamp is on 30 acres and on very steep terrain, very high fire danger, and it seems like nobody cares. So that's some of my concerns to start with. I will be watching. Any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions, but I think the board is contemplating a legal model so that we do have standards and we can bring people into compliance, whereas right now HipCamps are likely operating outside of oversight. So thank you for your comments.
There's no doubt they're outside of anybody's preview.
Okay, thank you. And that concludes public comment. It's back. Oh, we have 3 voicemails. And Chief, the fire and ambulance items are scheduled for 1:30.
Hi, my name's Cosmo Canebra. I live in Compchi. Addressing Agenda 5B, I'm going to read a letter that I wrote to Ted Williams regarding HipCamp. Here it goes. The reason for the email today concerns my little HipCamp operation. I received a letter from the Mendocino County tax collector asking me to pay the bed tax as well as get a business license for my HipCamp. They were kind enough to include in their letter the application forms associated with both items. Happy to comply with the governmental needs, I almost immediately returned the completed forms along with the personal checks to pay the associated fees. My next interaction was with an employee at the Department of Building and Planning. He informed me that it would be nearly impossible to get the major use permit needed to acquire the proper licensing needed to run my little operation. He suggested I withdraw my application for a business and he could then destroy my check. I received no response from the tax people who I also sent a check to. I assume they will cash it. I am fairly upset with the situation. I did a little research on the permitting of campgrounds in our county, and I see the only option is the major use one, which calls for a minimum of 10 campsites. I was only operating 5 sites. The waste was going into a permitted septic system designed for a 4-bedroom house. I am the only resident of the house. I am aware that there is somewhat of a bad name developing around the HipCamp platform. People believe the campers defecate on the ground and cause fires or a fire risk. In my experience, this is absolutely incorrect. My guests are respectful of the environment in all ways. They bring much good to the region. Also, because I live and work on my land, I obviously do not want my house and land burnt up or pooped on. I maintain close control over my space. I believe I was running a model camp and only good was coming from it. Financially, it has been a blessing allowing me to stay a resident in this town. I would love to have you drop by to look at the infrastructure, observe the fire safety aspects, and breathe in the general vibe of the land. I offer any other supervisors the same opportunity if they're interested in accompanying you. I would like to provide you with details regarding my personal hosting experience, knowledge, thoughts, and other input on the small campground subject. I realize that this is asking a lot for you to take the time to visit my small operation, but it sure would be great if you could. I want you to hear both sides of this story. I am concerned you have heard more complaints than good things about HipCamp. Thanks for your attention. Cosmo Canebra.
My name is Ellen Beekner of Casper, California. I would like to comment on agenda item 5B for the June 8th meeting. I am in support of low-intensity camping in Mendocino County. We are landowners on the Mendocino coast, owners of Fortunate Farm. We were able to have hip camping for a short time before the trade tax was passed, and we realized that we did not have the proper certification. When we realized how draconian the requirements would be to get that certification, we had to drop camping on our property as an option for us. This had a negative financial impact on us. More importantly, though, the experience of having camping for a short time showed us how beneficial the practice is for the community, for tourist revenues, giving visitors to the coast a place to camp respectfully without a lot of the crowding and overflow. We also feel that we gave them a very good educational and community experience while here. We're very, very careful with our land. We had very positive experiences with respectful people, and we would love to be a part of a common sense, not as intrusive certification or process to be able to do this. We think that encouraging agritourism for small farms helps our small farms stay in business. And we'll really look forward to seeing how well this works in the test program inland and hopefully bring it to the coast soon. So I do urge you to consider an ordinance allowing private landowners to get just really simple, straightforward licensing that doesn't trigger the need for a coastal development permit for those who are willing to respectfully, carefully, and safely host a reasonable number of people on their private property to help them pay their bills and to help keep tourism alive in Mendocino County. Thank you very much.
Greetings, supervisors. My name is Kathy Brown, and I am making a comment on item 5B, temporary camping for profit on private property today. I am commenting to urge you to take immediate action by making allowances in the zoning codes for all landowners, including Williamson Act landowners who are prohibited from allowing temporary camping on their property. I'm a retired high school teacher, 25-year Williamson Act landowner, small organic farm and business owner, and caregiver in the 3rd District of Mendocino County. We are off-grid homesteaders pivoting towards generating a sustainable income from our homestead. Like most, we have had a tough past couple of years sustaining ourselves in Mendocino County. I've lost my job as a chemist, and we found it impossible to sustain ourselves through generating an income from farming produce alone. Being the 41st ranked poorest county in California out of 58 counties, it's rough to find employment with a suitable wage that will cover our bills as I simultaneously provide 24/7 care to my mother. We have reached a point of desperation where we must sell our property and move or find a way to diversify our income. We've discovered agritourism can provide this diversification that we need. People will pay to camp on our property, tour our off-grid homestead, eat from our garden, and experience the outdoors on our property. We will be bringing people to Mendocino County from all over the world using camping apps like HipCamp with a global reach. Agritourism coupled with ecotourism can provide us with an actual sustainable income, and we won't have to sell our property in a panic. Unfortunately, Mendocino County requires all landowners initiate an $8,000 application for a special use permit. This application does not guarantee automatic acceptance, and all Williamson Act owners will lose their $8,000 due to the prohibition in the zoning. Mendocino County policy is blatantly financially exclusionary. Being one of the most poverty-stricken counties with people losing their jobs, such exclusion is illogical and detrimental to everybody. With landowners allowed to open up their property for low-impact camping, Mendocino County opens the doors for us to generate tax income. I urge you to stop with the financial exclusions that prevent people from sustaining themselves through diversifying our income, and to provide the county with taxes generated through transient occupancy tax. Please step up and give a hand to the landowners in Mendocino County, embrace the residents, and forge a team with us, working with the community. Mendocino can become a role model of how to recover from the poverty that exists here. Eliminate the cost.
That concludes public comment. It's back to the board. Planning and building, have you received adequate direction today?
I'm going to actually look to our consultant as well, Eric Norris, and see whether or not there's anything additional, Eric, that you think we need to hear from the board today, or if we have enough direction to start working on this.
I think we do. I look forward to working with Julia and her staff, but I think we have some pretty clear direction here on where you want to go. We'll compare notes afterwards, but I think we have pretty clear direction on where to go. There may be some options that come back to you, but I think we know what those will be.
And subsequent related topic is the enforcement that's been underway, and staff has followed board direction. There's no question we asked to bring the sites into compliance, and compliance in a lot of cases probably meant shutting them down. I'm concerned about shutting down sites that will qualify under our ordinance eventually, and where there's a fire risk, sanitation concern, other public safety risk, by all means. But I have heard that there may be some sites that are being shut down due to complaints filed for competitive reasons by other businesses, and I don't think that should be our number one priority. Supervisor Mulhern?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think that that should be our number one priority either, and I'm a little bit concerned about how far the timeline will stretch out. In one of my greatest concerns is not only with the sanitation, but without having a policy or an actual directive to not allow fires at any campsites that operate as a HipCamp or other camp facility. And I understand that it's challenging without the policy moving forward. I don't know what opportunities we have as a board to try to mitigate that before this summer.
County Council?
We may be able, if the concern is specific to the fires, we may be able to do something that's a little bit more limited and targeted and be able to bring something forward on an interim basis. But I suspect that the overall changes that we're talking here, we're probably not going to be able to make them a very quick process that would be done before this summer.
County Council, could we direct staff to deprioritize enforcement of sites that do not pose as a public safety risk, including fire?
Yes, and I believe that would also be consistent with your other direction with respect to prioritizing cannabis enforcement.
Is there support for the board on that idea? Okay, I see a majority. Can we record that as direction?